David Pakman claims that collectivization, or common ownership of the means of production, is authoritarian. In a debate with Peter Coffin, he said the following:
if you enforce that the means of production must be owned in common, that is an authoritarian action to take. And I don't believe, or at least I've not seen any evidence, although I'm willing to have my mind changed, that you will end up with an egalitarian, self-determining society if you impose it in an authoritarian way. That's sort of number one, right? That's like a fundamental problem I have with pure socialism.
There are a number of problems I have with David's argument here. The first is that socialism historically has traditionally stood for democratic workers' control over the means of production, and libertarian socialists or anarchists would argue that that kind of common ownership is inherently conflictual with centralized, state-owned command economies, which David doesn't really acknowledge. When he's saying that collectivization is authoritarian, he's not acknowledging the libertarian tendency. What libertarian socialists want is for the economy to be run by means of horizontal, free federation of workers' councils. What that means is that what to produce, how to produce it, and what to do with the products are all decided in a direct democracy of, by, and for the workers. What I would like to know is, in what sense is workers' self-management authoritarian when contrasted with a capitalist or state-run system where the bulk of the population has to continually take orders from bosses or government bureaucrats? Capitalism is imposed by violence. Private ownership of the means of production requires that the capitalist class of private owners use violence to protect their proprietarian system and contain the threat of workers' democracy, which is inherently conflictual with the capitalist system. Using violence to stop working people from managing our own affairs, that is authoritarian. It is the case that if we wanted to establish a libertarian socialist system, we would be up against that violence. So, would we have to use violence to establish common ownership of the means of production? And if yes, would that be authoritarian? I think that the expropriation of capitalists in order to transfer the ownership of the means of production from the capitalists to the workers would likely have to be carried out by violence. But that's only necessary because of the violence that they use against us. So, is coercive expropriation of capitalists authoritarian? Well, libertarian socialists argue that the use of such force should be organised by the working class itself by means of horizontal federations of workers' councils and militias, and we choose to organise in a non-hierarchical manner precisely because we don't want to reproduce authoritarian social relations. We pick up on exactly the point that David raises, that you can't produce a free, egalitarian society by authoritarian means. David doesn't acknowledge that the use of force against capitalists does not have to be organised in a hierarchical manner, nor does he acknowledge the defensive nature of that violence against a system which is fundamentally authoritarian and violent. A crucial point that David misses is that there exists the tradition of prefiguration. Prefiguration emerged out of exactly these concerns that you can't produce a free society by authoritarian means. This argument was made way back by anarchists when they split from the First International. They said that, in the Saint-Vallier circular, the society of the future should be nothing other than the universalization of the organization with which the International will have endowed itself. We must, therefore, be careful to ensure that this organization comes as close as possible to our ideal. How can we expect an egalitarian and free society to emerge from an authoritarian organization? Impossible. The International, as the embryo of the human society of the future, is required in the here and now to faithfully mirror our principles of freedom and federation and shun any principle leading towards authority and dictatorship. David would do well to look into these historical anarchist discussions about means and ends, and the fact that if we want to build an egalitarian society, we have to create horizontal social relations in the existing world as it is. That's the whole point of the tradition of prefiguration. Anarcho-syndicalism is a revolutionary labour strategy which involves the creation of labour unions organised in a horizontal anarchist manner which seek to seize the means of production by means of a general strike. Syndicalist unions are both organisations of struggle in the existing world and they form the organs of economic workers' democracy that are integral to the running of the future society. I doubt that David has heard of this, but if he has, I really doubt that he has any kind of sound argument as to why anarcho-syndicalism would somehow be authoritarian. David also made these similar kinds of arguments that collectivization is authoritarian in his video Why I'm Not a Socialist. He says the following.
Fundamentally, I'm not a socialist because I want an egalitarian, free, self-determining society. And that type of society will not emerge from authoritarian apparatus.
If you want a free, egalitarian, self-determining society, and you recognise that that can't be achieved by authoritarian means, the answer is not to dismiss socialism outright, but instead advocate a non-authoritarian strategy to achieving it. Strategies which David just doesn't seem to be aware of.
And what that means is that at the national level, socialist and communist structures are fundamentally authoritarian. And at scale, enacting socialism or communism becomes authoritarian. And a top example is Venezuela.
Of course, Venezuela isn't an example of libertarian socialism, though he doesn't say that it is, he just says that it's socialism generally. He hasn't familiarized himself with the libertarian critiques of these kinds of state-run systems where the state undertakes the functions of the capitalist class. He would do well to read Noam Chomsky's essay on the Soviet Union versus socialism, or Emma Goldman's My Disillusionment in Russia, or Maurice Brinton's pamphlet on the Bolsheviks and workers' control. He obviously isn't aware of the left libertarian critique of these kinds of state-run systems. Being a socialist doesn't mean being a Bolshevik. He also isn't aware of revolutionary Spain from 1936 to 39, in which socialist structures of workers' self-management were organised across the society in a non-authoritarian way. Gas, electricity and all sorts of other utilities were collectivized and brought under workers' control rather than centralized in the hands of the state. That was a non-authoritarian socialist system involving millions of people, which was crushed from the outside by the combined forces of fascists and Stalinists. David doesn't recognize that a non-authoritarian socialist alternative to capitalism is viable. It's just not tolerated by people on all sides of the political spectrum who seem to agree that the freedom of workers has to be crushed. So that's my response to David Pakman. I hope that he sees this video and perhaps reconsiders his views. I hope that he learns about anarcho-syndicalism and prefiguration and perhaps answers the question as to whether he thinks that they are somehow authoritarian strategies. There must be so many well-meaning people out there who've been banging their head against the proverbial wall of electoral politics for years to no avail. The time for liberals to re-examine their beliefs and to learn about the revolutionary solution is now. Jimmy Dore seems to be beginning to recognise that the massively unequal distribution of wealth that exists in our society is a result of the capitalist system and exactly the kinds of tendencies which Marx criticised. Libertarian socialism is a viable alternative for people who want a free, egalitarian, self-determining society and see capitalism and authoritarianism as being inherently corrosive to that end. Many thanks to my contributors on Patreon: Brandon Halkus Tischer, Comrade Dr. Fraser Crane, Cyclodeon, Deviath Fur, Drakur, Flagburner, Jack Bryant, Joe Martin, Comrade Klaus, Michael Norling, Patrick Gordon, Richard Pearson, Vrisha Jures, and XXX Swagmaster420 XXX. This has been Libertarian Socialist Rants. Thanks for watching.